ever happened even 5 years ago, right? So the last word is that if it weren't true, APAC wouldn't be working so hard to recruit students and to be on campus and try to roll back the divestment, boycott, sanctions movement, because as far as they're concerned, they present it, they sell it as a security issue when it's a justice issue.
So this question is particularly for you, Dr. Kelly, but Dr. Galatza, please feel free to pitch in as you feel necessary. And going off of that last comment, you slightly referenced it. The question often arises of the idea of Palestine as an apartheid state in relation to South Africa as an apartheid state. So the question is, what are your thoughts on using this reference, on referencing the situation in Palestine as apartheid?
Well, that's an excellent question, and of course, you know, I could speak for hours on exactly how Israel is an apartheid state in terms of law, legal sanctions, and the like. But let me just begin by saying a couple of things. One is that the argument that Israel is moving to or it has become an apartheid state is actually being made in Israel itself. That's something I heard very often, frequently, not by Palestinians, but by Israelis, you know. And in fact, there are people even in the Likud party who've made that claim. Now, if you think about what apartheid is, the UN definition of apartheid is any measures designed to prevent a racial group or groups from participation in the political, social, economic, and cultural life of the country, including the right to leave and to return to their country, the right to a nationality, the right to freedom of movement in residence, the right to freedom of opinion and expression. That's very, very clear. And Israel violates all those basic principles. But if you take specifically the law itself, you have laws like the 1950 absentee property law, which basically legalized the expropriation of people in 1948, literally seizing their land and property and making it illegal for them to make any claims to that property and land. You have a settler expansion that's going on right now. In fact, there was just today there was an announcement of even more settlements that are basically producing a divided, occupied territory. Now, I haven't even mentioned apartheid inside of Israel itself. I mean, the fact that in the occupied territories there are roads that are settler-only roads, that Palestinians can only drive on those roads if they're cab drivers or if they're working for a company driving a truck that's an Israeli company. There's so many legal sanctions that, in fact, it looks a lot like the apartheid laws that were passed under the National Party in South Africa. But in addition to legal sanctions, you also have an apartheid economy. One, again, that's different from South Africa, for the reasons I mentioned, so I'm not going to repeat that. But it's one in which inequality is institutionalized and made very, very clear in terms of access to land, goods, services, good wages. And finally, one of the most draconian elements of the apartheid system is the ways in which families are split up, that there are people who are spouses, children, relatives, who, if they live in the West Bank as opposed to being a so-called Israeli Palestinian citizen of Israel, they can't live in the same place. And these are laws that are passed. And we can go on to all specific examples, but the fact of the matter is that you don't have to believe me. The United Nations makes it clear that Israel is an apartheid state. And there's a long history of Israel identification with South Africa, both in terms of selling arms under apartheid South Africa, but also the idea that that South Africa, whose founders had a relationship to Nazis, that South Africa comes closest to the Israeli experience of settler colonialism. That is, how do you deal with the people who are in the way? And that's very, very clear in some of the discussion. So there's lots of examples, but I won't go into them, but we could talk about that in detail.
I mean, I think that like, you know, in terms of like using that analogy, I mean, I think that like, we can get caught up in definitions of it, and I think, you know, Professor Kelly articulated kind of the internationally recognized definition of it. But I'm wondering, maybe a question rhetorically to throw back is like, why not use that comparison? Right? Why not? What's at stake for, you know, when we do use it? What are we really saying? That, does that mean then that we can't begin to articulate a kind of particular critique of Zionism and the way in which it's treating Palestinians, right? And that therefore then take a kind of quiescent approach that's complicit with power, so therefore then we shouldn't speak about it? Is that what's at stake, right? And I think this is part of what is so central to thinking about this idea of narrative, which is central to kind of this question of the human. And I think that's why it's really important for us to begin to draw those connections. This is what's been central to the Black radical imagination. Not the Black radical imagination as some define it, you know, because that's not the Black radical imagination, right? I'm talking about the Black radical imagination of Malcolm X, of the Black Panther Party, right? Huey Newton wrote an essay, I talk about it in my book, in 1970 on the question of the Middle East, right? SNCC had its famous 1967 piece on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Malcolm himself wrote a piece in the Egyptian Gazette in 1964 on Zionism, right? And Professor Kelly is part of this Black left internationalist tradition that continues. I talked about it in a piece I recently wrote on Assata Shakur, that Angela Davis just got back from Palestine. Alice Walker, Cynthia McKinney, Professor Kelly, a whole host of Black radicals and Black leftists continue to support the question of Palestinian sovereignty and self-determination. And for me to be silent on it, to me, is the biggest crime, no matter who you are.
So to transition into the next question, some of the ideas that were raised, and obviously one of the big prevalent ideas on this campus is this idea of bordering. We have the wall out all week, and that's definitely one of the ideas that is raised when discussing apartheid. So this is particularly for Dr. Dalatse, but again, Dr. Kelly, please feel free to contribute. Could you expand on the idea of borders and citizenship and the framework that develops in Palestine specifically, but also in a larger global context?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of Palestine specifically, I mean, if you begin to think about, you know, how important borders are, kind of the framework of the nation state, they're what gives things coherence, you know. There's one way to think about borders as defining what is and what isn't, right? What is, but it's also about defining it about what's not or what's excluded, right? And so there's various ways to think about this idea of borders. And we can talk about physical borders. We can talk about the way in which the West Bank, as currently constructed, is ultimately, like, as some have used the metaphor of Swiss cheese, essentially, right? So that when we begin to think about these non-contiguous or non-contiguous spaces that Palestinians live in, we see that there's not a coherent state that exists there. So any argument for a two-state solution becomes immediately problematic in that sense. And even the argument that some have been making about the one-state solution is that it would still be a one state within an expanding frontier of this place called Israel. And that would still be the one state, right? And so the idea that borders can be a way of thinking about national belonging or sovereignty, to me, is a troubling one. Even for the question for, even when it comes for the issue of Palestinians. Because I think that, you know, we can think about physical borders, and, you know, I'm really interested in this idea of maps and territories. I did a talk at Stanford a few months ago, and I'm working through this idea of the map is not the territory, right? That there's a way in which the map, as this instrument of power, is a particular way of making legible what those relationships are. You look at a map, you can see who belongs where, who doesn't belong, right? But the map isn't the territory. The territory is how people actually on the ground are dealing with those actual borders. And again, 100 miles south of here, you can see some very ingenious ways that people are doing that. Let alone here in the US, in terms of like, while they might not be literal borders here between Irvine, say for example, and South LA, right? Or Irvine and Santa Ana, right? They might be a little bit more murky and ambiguous, but there's some really ingenious ways that people transcend borders. And so I think we can think about physical borders, but I'm also interested in thinking about ideological borders, right? And the borders that exist that prevent even solidarity from happening, which I think is important for us to think about. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways that we can do that. As the specifics of like the kind of, you know, Israeli apartheid state in terms of how it uses those borders, you know, based on my experience, I can't speak from that experience. And maybe Professor Kelly can, so I'll be done there.
I completely agree, and I'm glad you're thinking about borders in these other ways. I'm actually going to throw out a couple things about the physical borders because it's something that's very striking about the wall. And there's two things, so 2 points I want to make. One is that the point of the wall, it's like enclosure. You know, you studied like in England the Enclosure Act, which is basically the elimination of the commons. There's something that's going on there where it operates as enclosure both to imprison a people, but enclosure to destroy the commons. And so what happens is that for a lot of Palestinians, the wall was right in the middle of it. It was built purposely in the middle of the land, to where people can't get to the land that they own on the other side of the wall, unless you go through a checkpoint, which could be miles and miles away. So the idea of the wall is both to contain, but also make difficult one's ability to get access to medical treatment, to the land that you own, to resources, and that's what the wall does. The other thing that the wall does is that it is a physical presence and a means of intimidation. It's meant to remind you, all under the myth of security, right? When in fact, most people who die in the region are Palestinians, you know, straight up. Who are killed are Palestinians, but it's all in the name of security to protect Israelis. And what I found striking was how many progressive Israelis were out there protesting the wall. You know, so it's kind of a myth to think it's sort of one side. But then the final thing I want to say about this, about the wall and sort of what it means both physically and symbolically, is that when we think about borders, it is subjugated people and the dispossessed who are contained by borders, who have to try to break through borders. And when they do break through borders, they're called illegal, right? Capital has no borders. Capital doesn't have a green card, you know. Capital can flow across borders all the time. And so what's ironic is that in some ways what's happening in Israel-Palestine is a metaphor for like US-Mexico, that settlers can flow on the other side of the West Bank, can flow and just create settlements at whim with no questions asked. And that's part of what settlers flows capital. And the same thing here, US-Mexico, where, you know, it's difficult for poor people struggling to leave the so-called free trade zones to make a living here crossing one border, but capital can flow on the other side so easily. And that's something we always have to remind ourselves, that if capital can flow, then let the people flow too. You know, you can eliminate borders, eliminate for everybody. So,
one of my good friends, who's very educated on this as well, says, why is it easier for? I mean, it's more, you know, acceptable for a box of oranges to exist here in Southern California than it is in Mexico, right? What does it mean for capital and commodity to exist in particular places and be okay? I mean, again, as I tell this to my students all the time, right? Read the labels, right? Read the labels on the shirts and clothing you're wearing when you go home. I almost guarantee none of it's made here. It's not, and this is legalized. This is legal. This is capitalism. This is the free market. But somebody, probably maybe in Bangladesh even, with the collapse of this sweatshop that went there, death count of 800 people. but there's people who are getting paid, next to nothing for the work that they're doing, so that commodities can exist here. iPhones, and I'm as guilty as anybody of that. I'm not here to say that I'm not, but just to suggest, as Professor Kelly was arguing, how easy it is for capital to move, but not for human beings.
Okay, just one thing real quickly. About and in fact, the viewers of this film would really appreciate this. Check it out. One of the amazing things that's happening in Israel is a wonderful scholar, Israeli scholar, Gershon, I think his last name. He demonstrated that one of the things that's happening in certain settlers, particularly Messianic settlers, the ultra-Orthodox, is that capital in communications industries exploit ultra-Orthodox women in the West Bank, in these settlements, and use them as cheap labor to do basically telecommunications and other kinds of industries. So when you think about like the nature of exploitation, you've got ultra-Orthodox Messianic settlers who are being exploited by capital in the West Bank because it's cheaper there. That flips everything. So we cannot always think about the neoliberal agenda as simply like the Palestinians versus the Israelis. It is in some ways it's very simple, in other ways it's more complicated in ways that we have to investigate and see, because if we don't see that, we sometimes end up pushing for a kind of two-state solution that will allow capital to do all of its business anyway, under Palestinian authority.
So for the sake of time, we're going to make this the last moderated Q&A before we open it up to the audience. But specifically for students, for activists, a big majority of the audience, when considering spaces of political organizing, particularly within groups of color, what are some key elements to consider for understanding Palestinian activism in reference to other social justice causes? And on the reverse of that, what kinds of benefits are available through Palestinian advocacy for other political spaces?
I think it's a great question, and it gets at the core, but I'm probably assuming that many of you probably already know the answers to those questions. The resolution here would not have passed had you not, so I'm not here to tell people what they don't already know, but maybe for those that don't, and on the one hand, one of the things I cautioned against even growing up was the sense that Palestine was a Muslim issue. This was about Islam. And I hate to break it to you guys, it's not, right? It's not about that. Many Palestinian Christians, right? And it's important for us to think about what's really at stake, which then makes you then, for those of you who think that, ask the question, what kind of Muslim do I want to be? Right? If you have to think about those who aren't Muslim in a particular way, and think about the question of social justice through that lens, right? That's really important. But at the same time, as I've been writing about and talking, that the figure of the Muslim, I wrote this piece today that, that came out in Al Jazeera, Are We All Muslim Now? Essentially making a kind of almost playful gesture that Assad Shakur is not now a Muslim, even though she's not, by being placed on the most wanted terrorist list, right? But that how the figure of the Muslim has become the kind of category for thinking about otherness, the predominant category for thinking about otherness today, right? And how this figure, it's not the believer, it's not that one who prays, it's not necessarily even that person who looks the part, the Sikhs, the Hindus, even the Latinos who might look the part, right? It's a more kind of ephemeral category of an unruly body, a body that doesn't belong, right? It's the way in which, as white supremacy has always done, it now reconstitutes itself. So for those people who often throw the argument, out, I'm sure, the ones who are making this film, they think that to talk about Muslims or Islam is to talk about religion. Why are you bringing this race stuff in, right? We have to understand that when it comes to Islam and Muslims and this so-called religious stuff, right, that when you think about the foundation of the modern concept of race and the very foundation of the West, it emerges out of the figure of the Moor, 1492, the modern concept of race, right? And many scholars have written about